This lecture is about the central nervous system. And of course, the central nervous system is mainly the brain and the spinal cord. The central nervous system is where all the control centers of the nervous system are located. The central nervous system interprets sensory data coming into the central nervous system and makes a decision about motor output based on reflexes, current conditions, and past experiences. The brain and the spinal cord initially begin as a tube in the embryo. It begins as a neural tube, and then over time, some vesicles or enlarged areas start to form. These are divided in the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. You can see the vesicles here starting to enlarge. And this is eventually going to become the parts of the brain. It goes through several different growth phases, but eventually you see that this forebrain area would become the cerebrum, cerebral cortex, the basal ganglia, thalamus, the hypothalamus, the retina. The midbrain is going to form the midbrain. The midbrain is going to be part of the brainstem that we'll discuss later in the lecture. And the hindbrain, or the lower part of the brain, forms the pons, the cerebellum, and the medulla oblongata. Again, we'll talk about all these sections later in this lecture. The brain is growing at the same time the skull is growing. The problem is that the brain is growing more than the skull will allow it to, so that's why the brain starts to wrinkle and it starts to make folds. And these folds allow for more surface area to take place in the brain tissue, so that there more neurons can develop and grow in a limited space of the cranium. So the wrinkles that you see on the brain are there because it increases the surface area, therefore it increases the number of neurons that the brain is capable of having. In the adult brain, there's three main divisions. There's the cerebrum, which is the largest part. There's the cerebellum, and there's the brainstem. Those are three areas of the human adult brain. We'll discuss each of those. And just so you know, the gyri are the folds on the cerebrum, and the sulci are the grooves between the gyri. If this were mountains and valleys, the gyri would be the mountains, the sulcus would be the valleys. And the gyri is a plural. The singular for the gyri is gyrus, G-Y-R-U-S, and the singular for sulci is sulcus, S-U-L-C-U-S. The longitudinal fissure separates the left brain from the right brain. That separates the left hemisphere from the right hemisphere. It's this large fissure that goes across the sagittal plane, splitting the brain in half. The brain is made up of several lobes. There's 5 different lobes. There's the frontal lobe, which is where the voluntary motor functions initiate: motivation, foresight, planning, memory, mood, emotion, social judgment, aggression are all from the frontal lobe. The parietal lobe is for interpreting and the general senses, taste, and some vision. But the occipital lobe is the main visual center of the brain. And the temporal lobe is the main center for hearing, smell, learning, and memory. The insula lobe is a lobe that's kind of hidden beneath the temporal lobe, and it helps understand spoken language and taste. To illustrate the function of the frontal lobe, there's a story that took place in 1848 when this Phineas Gage was a railroad construction foreman. He was blasting rock, and a 13-pound iron rod shot up through his brain. And you can see the picture of how the rod went through his skull. And you'd think this would kill him, but it didn't. He lived another 11 years after this injury, but he was different. He could still walk and talk, he could work, he could travel, but he has changed. His personality was changed. Whereas before he was very dependable and well liked, the new Phineas was crude and unpredictable. So it just lets you know that the frontal lobe has a lot to do with personality and those traits that make us human. It gives frontal lobe is also important for impulse control and responsible for making good judgments. Uh, it's been determined that the frontal lobe is not fully developed until the middle to late 20s. So this may explain why teenagers may make some poor judgments compared to older young adults. We look at some different divisions of the brain. You see these. The central sulcus is the sulcus that separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. It goes all the way from the temporal lobe, goes all the way up to the longitudinal fissure. It's one sulcus that goes all the way up and it separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. The lateral sulcus you see here separates the temporal lobe from the parietal and the frontal lobe. It's a sulcus that's right here. There's a parietal occipital sulcus that separates the parietal lobes from the occipital lobe. Now this is the central gyrus. This is the central sulcus here. The gyrus in front of that is the precentral gyrus. Pre meaning before, and the postcentral gyrus is behind the central sulcus. We discussed in the last lecture the structure of a nerve, how you have the cell body and the axon hillock, and then you have the long axon covered with myelin. In the central nervous system and also in the peripheral nervous system, we don't have a single neuron acting alone. The nerves are bound in groups and bundles of neurons. In the central nervous system, when you have a bundle of nerves together, the cell bodies are called the nuclei, and the axons are called tracts in the central nervous system. To compare that to the peripheral nervous system, the cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system are called ganglia, and the nerve axons bundles are called nerves. The brain has gray matter and white matter. The gray matter basically is groups of the cell bodies and the dendrites, whereas the white matter are a group of axons clustered together. The white matter is called white matter because the myelin gives it a white color, a white appearance. But the gray matter is the cell body and the dendrites and unmyelinated nerves. It's found on the outer layer of the brain. You see the gray matter here is on the outer layer of the brain. And also there's some deep gray matter here. This forms the basal nucleus, the basal ganglia nucleus down in here. And in between that is white matter, which is the groups of axons clustered together. This white is because of the myelin, and this forms tracts throughout the central nervous system. So you could imagine the cell body of the nerve would be up in this area here, and it send its long axon tract down and through the white matter, and eventually on down into the brainstem, into the spinal cord, down to the muscle that it needs to innervate. The cerebral cortex, that's the part of the brain that sort of the executive function of the brain. It makes us aware of ourselves, makes us aware of our sensations, helps us communicate, helps us to remember, helps us to understand and initiate voluntary movements. All that's done from the cerebral cortex. That's the thinking part of the brain as well. The cerebral cortex has three kinds of areas, of functional areas. There's motor areas, sensory areas, and association areas. Motor areas have to do with controlling of skeletal muscles and movement. This is the primary motor cortex is located in the precentral gyrus. You see it here highlighted in red. There's cell bodies in this gyrus have axons that go down to the spinal cord, and they control muscles on the opposite side of the body. Now, in front of the primary motor cortex, there's a premotor cortex. The premotor cortex doesn't control the muscle movements, but it helps plan muscle movements. So if you're picking up a glass of or a cup of coffee, think of the muscles that you have to employ to pick up a cup of coffee. There's the biceps contracting. There's the hips have to stabilize so that you don't fall over. Your back has to remain erect. You hold your head back. So all these muscles have to be coordinated and timed just right to accomplish that task. All that planning takes place in the premotor cortex, or the motor association area. So it plans the sequence and the sequence of muscle movements to accomplish a task. Broca's area is a specific area of the premotor cortex that has to do with speech and language. This controls the muscles of speech, the tongue and the throat muscles, and it is especially devoted to this area. The Broca's area is only seen in one hemisphere, usually the left hemisphere, so there's not a Broca's area on the right hemisphere. The Broca's area on the left hemisphere controls the speech and language, which affects both sides. Damage to the Broca's area causes a Broca's aphasia, which is somebody that has a stroke in the Broca's area. They have difficulty speaking fluently, but they can understand very well. They can understand the spoken language well. But when they try to speak, their language is a non-fluent. They have a hard time with word finding and expressing the sentences. Now there's a primary somatosensory cortex. We talked about the primary motor cortex before on the precentral gyrus. The postcentral gyrus has a primary somatosensory cortex. Here we have axons and nerves that receive input from sensors all over the body, and they eventually wind up at the somatosensory cortex. That's when you become aware of a sensation. You're aware of an itch or a painful sensation. You're aware of it because of the somatosensory cortex. And this also receives input from the opposite side of the body. Usually the brain, one half of the brain receives input and controls the opposite side of the body. Now, the somatosensory association area is analogous to the motor association area that plans the movements. The somatosensory association area integrates the sensory inputs and tries to help make sense of the sensory inputs and try to basically explain those sensory inputs to the somatosensory cortex. The somatosensory association area is what allows you to reach in your pocket and find an object and know it's a coin, and not only know it's a coin, but you can tell if it's a nickel or a penny or a quarter just by the feel of it. It's the somatosensory association area that helps you determine those coins based on just the feel alone, based on the sensory input. There's a primary visual cortex. It's on the occipital lobe. It receives information from the vision from the retina. Damage to the primary visual cortex results in a functional blindness. So the eyes and retina may work, but if the visual cortex is injured, the person is functionally blind. There's a visual association area for the visual cortex as well. This helps us recognize objects like the human face and helps us interpret visual stimulus of color, form, and movement. Damage to the primary visual cortex results in functional blindness, but damage to the visual association area makes the person so they can see, but they can't really understand what they're looking at. So they may have a hard time recognizing a human face or recognize the face of somebody they know. There's an auditory cortex, primary auditory cortex in the temporal lobe. It also receives input from the hearing from the ears and hearing. It receives pitch and loudness, localization of sound information, and you might have guessed it. There's an auditory association area too that basically helps explain the sounds to the sensory to the auditory sensory cortex, so that the sounds make sense. So it understands what the sounds mean. So the association areas basically are like provide explanation or support for the primary cortexes. The limbic association area is a large area of the brain that involves many different structures, mainly on the medial aspect of the cerebral hemisphere. The limbic system controls our emotional responses and is involved in memory processing. Memory is often tied into emotion. Something that makes an emotional impact is more likely to be something that you remember. Here's the areas that are pertinent to the limbic system. It's on the medial aspect of the cerebral cortex. So this corpus callosum is the parahippocampal gyrus here. Hippocampus is here. All this are parts of the limbic system. This is the story of Henry Mollison in 1953. He had epilepsy and he had a portion of his brain removed. The part of the brain that was removed was the hippocampus on both sides. And as we said, the hippocampus has to do with memory. After his surgery, he was not able to restore new memories. He lived basically the rest of his life in the present moment. He would forget any new experience within 30 seconds, but yet he remained knowledge of all of his childhood and all the things that happened to him up until the time of his surgery. He still had a good language skills and he had a good IQ, because all this was learned before his memory difficulties. But after surgery, he was not able to make new memories. The reticular activating system is another multimodal association area. It involves many areas of the brain, and basically it's what keeps our attention focused on a task or a object or a lecture or drive in the when you drive your car. When the reticular activating system is kind of what keeps you alert and it keeps you focused on a task. I mentioned earlier the deep nucleus in the brain, these are the basal nuclei, deep gray matter. So this would be in this region here of the brain. The caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus are the basal nuclei. Disorders of this nucleus result in motor dysfunction such as Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease, and other movement disorders. This is some of the features of Parkinson's disease. Deep brain stimulation is a new treatment for Parkinson's disease where the caudate or the globus pallidus or the basal ganglia is stimulated directly through an electrical current, and it relieves a lot of the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. Inside the brain, there are cavities filled with fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. These cavities are called ventricles. There's 4 ventricles. There's a right and left lateral ventricle. There's a third ventricle, and there's a fourth ventricle. And this continues on in the spinal cord as the central canal of the spinal cord. But there's fluid that circulates through all this complex of these ventricles and central canal. The cerebrospinal fluid serves 3 purposes. It supports the brain. It makes the brain basically floats on the cerebrospinal fluid. It helps to protect the brain, and it also helps to transport chemicals and nutrients and transport chemical messengers and waste products, similar to blood. The thalamus is an area of the brain that's important for sensory processing. It processes sensory input from all over the body, and then relays the information that's the important information. It relays that up to the cerebral cortex, to the somatosensory cortex. It also relays signals from the cerebellum to the cerebrum. And cerebellum, as we'll see in a few minutes, that has to do with control of timing of muscle control, so that you have coordination and you have fine-tune the coordination of muscle movement. And the thalamus is also involved with the limbic system due to the emotional functions of memory. Below the thalamus is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is the main control center of the autonomic nervous system, and it helps maintain a lot of the body homeostasis. I call it the control freak because it wants to control everything. Here's just some of the things that hypothalamus controls. You see, it's a quite extensive list of things that the hypothalamus can control. I'll let you read this. I won't read that, but you can see it controls many features of homeostasis throughout the body. The cerebellum is next part we'll talk about. There's two cerebellar hemispheres and a vermis, which is the central area. The vermis is the central area here. The function of the cerebellum is to correct voluntary muscle contraction and posture based on sensory data, based on the actual movements. So it kind of helps see the brain sends out a signal as to what movement is desired. The sensory feedback goes back to the brain to say what movement actually occurred, and the cerebellum helps to make those closer together, to help make it more coordinated and more functional movement. I'll let you can just read this. I'll give you a few seconds to read this. The third paragraph, the cerebellar cortex calculates the best way to coordinate the force, direction, and extent of a muscle contraction to prevent overshoot, to maintain the posture, and to produce smooth, coordinated movements. So the cerebellum has to do with coordination of movements. There's the white matter in the cerebellum is called the arbor vitae, and its arbor means tree, so it's just like the branches of a tree. Now moving into the brainstem, there's three parts of the brainstem. There's the midbrain, located here, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The midbrain has a couple of features. The corpora quadrigemina, that's a part of the brain that helps you coordinate head and eye movements when you follow an object visually, like when you're watching a tennis ball come across your field of vision, or to help you catch a football or a baseball. The substantia nigra is also located in the midbrain. That's an area of a darkened area that secretes a melanin, which is a precursor of dopamine. This nucleus is connected to the basal ganglia and also is very instrumental in the development of Parkinson's disease when this substantia nigra is damaged. The pons helps control alertness and respiration, and basically it's a bridge between the brain and the spinal cord. There's tracks going up and down from the cerebral cortex in the somatosensory area down to the spinal cord, and they intersect here in the pons area. The medulla oblongata connects the brain to the spinal cord. It's the lowest portion of the brain stem. It regulates features like heart rate, blood pressure, diameter, blood pressure, respiratory rate, digestive activities, and it coordinates involuntary activities like chewing, swallowing, or vomiting, so that you don't have to think about what muscles you have to contract to swallow or to chew. It just does it automatically. I put this in here to illustrate the stroke versus TA. A stroke can occur in any part of the brain. So we've talked about a lot of parts of the brain. If there's a stroke in any of those parts, you lose control of that function. And so a stroke can present in many number of ways. It could be weakness, it could be sensory problems, it could be language problems, it could be problems with coordination. So anytime you see something that looks like a neurological injury, it's best to assume it's a stroke and get help and call 911 to try to get some help. The definition of a TIA is basically a stroke that only lasts 24 hours. It's still very serious to have a TIA. It's just fortunate that it didn't last, but it may be a warning that a stroke may be present in the near future. So TIA should be evaluated also. Now moving on down into the spinal cord, which is also part of the central nervous system. Throughout the brain and the spinal cord, there's three meninges, or fibrous connective tissue membranes, that cover the spine and the brain. the spinal cord and the brain. These are from superficial to deep. These are called the dura mater, the arachnoid matter, and the pia mater. Those are just layers of protective coverings over the nerves of the spinal cord and the brain. If you look at a cross section of the spinal cord, this darkened butterfly shaped area, that's the gray matter. So that would be the white blood. Part of this would be the cell bodies of the neurons. And this area surrounding that is white matter. Those would be that's where the tracks of the spinal cord run up and down the spinal cord. So the central gray area is basically the gray matter, and it's surrounded by the white matter. In the posterior portion of the spine, we have mainly ascending sensory tracts. So these are sensory nerves. These are sensory nerve fibers coming in here. They come into the posterior part of the spinal cord. And once they're in here, they go up and down the spine. Remember, this is a cross section of the spinal cord. So the dimension in and out of the page, up and down from the page, would be going up to the brain or down to the lower extremities. But the sensory portion of the spinal cord is the posterior spinal cord. The anterior part of the spinal cord is the motor portion. Here's some anterior horn. That's where the motor nerve cell bodies are. They send the axons down through this ventral root here, and they join with the sensory nerves to form a mixed spinal nerve. Mixed nerve meaning they have both motor and sensory nerve fibers. And remember that these previous few slides are just cross sections, but they're tracks that go up and down the spinal cord. This picture illustrates the tracks. This would be sensory tracks that are ascending. Remember, ascending tracks are afferent fibers. Descending tracks are efferent fibers. Descending tracks carry motor information from the brain down to the extremities to create the movement. The ascending tracks bring sensory information from all over the body up to the brain, so they ascend. At the end of the spinal cord, there's a conus medullaris. That's the tip of the spinal cord, and it ends at approximately L2 or L3 area. So it doesn't go all the way down to the lowest lumbar area. It ends at L2 or 3. Below that are a collection of nerves called the cauda equina. Here's the conus medullaris, and the cauda equina is below that. Cauda equina literally means horse's tail, because it reminded the anatomist of a horse's tail with all these nerve fibers coming down. Eventually these nerve fibers exit the intervertebral foramen and go on down to the extremities and innervate the muscles that control the lower extremities.